everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And just wanted to start off by introducing ourselves, and then we'll do just some quick housekeeping stuff, and then we'll get right into the content. So my name is Ashley Bray. I'm the Disability and Learning Skills Advisor for the School of Continuing Studies. So I work with all of the students in the MPS, the BALS, the DLS, and the MALS program. And then this is my colleague. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Ballat. I'm the Learning Skills Specialist on main campus. So I work with all of our undergrads, grad students, anything from time management, procrastination, these beautiful webinars that Ashley and I have been putting together. So feel free to stop by or reach out if you'd like to schedule a consultation.
And just to make note, we are part of the Academic Resource Center. On main campus, we're located in the Levy Tower 335. And at the School of Continuing Studies, I'm located in the Program Administration Suite in C144. If you have any questions, you can always get in contact with us via email, or you can always email the main ARC account, arc@georgetown.edu. And just to note, we will have a Q&A session at the end, so if you have questions, feel free to kind of save them to the end if you're on the phone, or if you want to chat them in the chat box, feel free to do that as well.
And we have two social media platforms that we send out most of our information, Facebook and Instagram. So those are the handles that are listed on the screen. Certainly follow us. There's a lot of good information that's sent out, events, just like this webinar. There's information that's sent out just on daily tips and tricks as the semester progresses. So really good information, and certainly connect with us so that you can get that information at your fingertips.
And you can also find our old webinars on our website, academicsupport.georgetown.edu. We're going to do these once a week throughout the rest of the semester, and they'll alternate between Tuesday and Wednesday. The last one we did was on kind of creating a study schedule, and you can find that on the website. And we'll post this one up tomorrow as well. And feel free to join us next Tuesday for our new webinar.
And the entire schedule is actually on our website as well, and that's where all the archived videos are going to be, just like Ashley mentioned. So if you're not sure of what date or time it is, they're all at 5:30, but all that information is also listed on our website. All right, so we're going to dive into note-taking, which we get a lot of questions from students about. What is good note-taking strategies? Is it important? Why do I have to do it? So this is how we're going to start out this webinar. Okay, so why is it important to take notes? So notes trigger memories of lectures, readings, and increase retention of the material. If you're just sitting in class and not taking notes, it's really easy to lose concentration, to kind of drift off into your own kind of world. So taking notes really keeps you actively engaged in the class. And again, it's a way to kind of combine the information that the professor thinks is most valuable and what's really going to show up on your next quizzes or test exams. Taking notes, like we mentioned, helps you concentrate in class and helps you really stay focused as you are partaking in the class session. And the notes create a resource for your exam preparation. So if you're not taking notes, it's going to be harder to really prepare for finals and for midterms if students haven't had midterms yet. So if you're really just working on a blank slate, it's going to be harder to really prepare and succeed in those exams. So if you're taking notes throughout your class sessions, you're already preparing material to study. All right, and here's some statistics for everybody. So studies show that people may forget 50% of a lecture within 24 hours, 80% of a lecture and 95% of a lecture within 1 month if they don't take notes. So hopefully we can look at these statistics and say, it is actually really important for me to take notes so that I am not losing 50% of the lecture within a day period if I don't take notes. So note-taking is very, very, very important. We can't stress that enough. All right, so some cues for note-taking. So really looking at the instructor's clues and some tips and tricks that they use in the classroom to figure out what is the most important information and should you be adding that to your notes. So the way The change in the speaker's voice, so their tone or pitch, can show emphasis. Okay, so if a professor is getting really excited about a certain concept or making a word or a concept, you know, kind of driving it home, the way that they talk about it could be a really big indicator that it is an change in rate of speech, so slowing down to give a definition. If they're slowing down, definitely take down as much of the definition as you can, okay? So just being aware of that. Listing and numbering points. So if the professor starts saying, okay, the most 3 important effects of such and such are, and starts listing out that information, jot that down on your notes, okay? Writing on the board, if there's any type of information, diagrams, graphs, anything that the professor is jotting down on the board, make sure you add that to your notes. It's really important that the professor makes giving an example, is teaching it in a different way, and it's also just going to help you remember the information later on if you jot down that information. If the professor makes a direct announcement, this is probably the biggest clue, making sure that you're highlighting this point in your notes, and he or she may turn this into a direct exam question. So if they say, this concept is really important, or remember page 3 of your textbook, that information is going to be really important, make sure you make a note of that in your notebook. All right, so a few more tips and tricks. So as you're note taking, use abbreviated words. So a lot of the concerns we hear from students is that they don't have enough time to take down every bit of material in class. So maybe you need to use abbreviated words or just short phrases to capture the information. The second point, use symbols to highlight important points. So this could be, we'll get to a few examples later on, but maybe you make your own symbols to capture the most important information or concepts if you're not able to write out the entire definition word for word from what the professor says. Symbols could also you know, be like an equal sign or just show shorter abbreviations for capturing that information. If you have information that doesn't seem as clear to you as you're taking down the notes, make a note of it. Put an exclamation point next to it. Make a note to yourself that you definitely need to go back and review that information after class. Okay, don't just say, well, that's not important information, I'm just going to breeze by it. Make sure that you're making some sort of symbol or note to yourself to go back and review that information. Okay, and possibly just recording a brief phrase for each of the details that explain a major point. So again, if you can't get down every single word of a sentence that the professor says, start jotting down the most important phrases and then go back and elaborate on your notes later on after class when you have a little bit more time. And here's an example of some ways that you can annotate your notes or just make some symbols as you're taking notes. So check mark could be, yep, I know this material, I've reviewed this for the past week, this is great, I don't necessarily need to spend as much time reviewing this information. Or a question mark could be something to note that you're really uncertain about that meaning or the concept is still unclear to you, and this would be a great place to jot this down in your planner or on a post-it note and take that directly to your professor's office hours and clear up that confusion. Or send an email to your professor and say, hey, I still have a few questions on this. Can I set up some time to come talk to you? Okay. You know, an asterisk for important, major idea, must know. Again, so you can kind of alter it depending on what fits your style and what makes the most sense to you. But this is just an example of some annotations that you can use as you are taking notes. Okay, and review and recite. So it's important to realize that your interaction with your notes should not end after class or be put off until the night before an exam. We strongly encourage you to review notes after class as possible, immediately after class or soon after if you have another class or directly after class. The reason being is you're able to remember this information better in the long term because you're going to clear up confusion and you're able to fill in missing parts of your notes that you weren't able to capture in class. So if we're not looking at our notes for a whole week or right before an exam, I'm going to forget what I meant when I jotted down just a simple, I'm going to forget what I meant by putting a symbol in my notes. But if I'm actually reviewing my notes immediately after class and have it, I'm going to start filling in information and starting to practice the information, figuring out what information do I still need to know and what information do I feel really comfortable with. And during this time, you can even add color coding and highlighting your notes to show emphasis, to highlight important vocab words that you need to just add to your rote memory. So color coding is a really great strategy for note taking, as well as underlining, or again, any of those annotations that we talked about before. Correct, revise, and add to your notes. So fill in the blanks with information that you missed or questions that you have. We discussed that, and that's something that's really, really, really important. Triple review, so read over your notes just after class, even that night, and then one day per week that you're denoting to reviewing those notes for those class. So if you are triple reviewing your notes, you are preparing as much as you can, and that information is going to be fresh in your mind when you are facing the semester and upcoming.
Okay, so there's a couple of apps that we really like for note-taking. The first one is Evernote. It's a great, just kind of standard note-taking online app. You can use it on your iPad, on your phone. You can also get access to it online. Papyrus is a great one for organizing your notes, so you can kind of color code notebooks by subject, arrange things. Microsoft Windows always already if you have Microsoft Office. Keep it's an online compatible with Google Drive and Google Docs. So if you are, you can access them on your phone, on your computer, wherever you're at. And then one of our favorites is Notability, and this is really great for capturing a lot of pictures along with text. So you can draw, create diagrams, and it's great for people learners and maybe classes where they're interactive. All right, so now that we talk about notes, I'm going to talk a little bit about outlining methods. So one of the ways that outlining is really important for you to begin study guides. And this is actually something that we're going to talk about on our finals webinar, is about using outlining is also a great way to combine your notes with information that your professor is providing you. So you can really gather all that information for the exam together in one place. And it's a great starting point for some self-testing strategies, and we will actually go over a few of those today. The first method of note-taking is called the Cornell Method. And as you guys can see, it's a very kind of structured way of note-taking. You have two columns. One, you don't need to get the measurements exactly right, but you have one column that's about 2.5 inches wide, and that's called the Q column. And you have another column that's about 6 inches wide, and that's where you're taking all your at the bottom, one of the reasons I really like the Cornell method is because at the bottom is where you summarize. And this strategy is great for providing a real systematic format to condensing your notes. And it's really easy to highlight major concepts using that Q column and then kind of getting those details in that note-taking area.
So Ashley, if you don't mind going back, so then I'm going to write, if I just understand this correctly, so I'm going to write a complete phrase or sentence in the note-taking area, right? Okay, and then I'm going to come up with some sort of cue that relates to that type of information.
Yeah, so maybe you're learning a hard physics concept. So you can kind of write that theory on the left-hand side in the Q column and use that note-taking area to explain the concept. You can do that in your own words to really help to remember it. And the Q column is great for, especially if you're having to learn definitions for foreign languages and being able to go back and look at definitions. One of the things I recommend to students with the Cornell Method, you can actually flip that note-taking side over on the back, and then it becomes a study sheet as well. You can flip back and forth.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you.
Welcome. All right.
Okay. So the outlining method is your typical and kind of traditional way of note-taking. I think this is what a lot of students use as they take notes, which is, perfectly fine if this works. So as you can see from the diagram listed, you're going to have, either use Roman numerals or decimals or some sort of marking to indicate what the main topic is. And then from there, you're going to indent in on your notes and list something related to that main topic. So we say body language is going to be kind of the overarching theme of what our lecture is going to be about. And then A, B, C, D is listed about the main topics related to body language. And then as you can see, the 1, 2, 3, 4 listed under each of those other categories are going to be the main details and the specific points that you want to remember regarding those type of categories. Okay, so I think this is definitely a typical way for students to take notes. This is a good way to actually turn these main points into questions. Okay, so if you can start coming up with questions from these notes, thinking about what may the professor ask on the next test or quiz, and coming up with those types of questions to assess your understanding. Again, it's all about making sure that you understand the material and check your own understanding, so you can turn this type of format into your own questions.
Last method that we're going to talk about in terms of outlining is the mapping method. And one of the reasons I really personally like the mapping method is because I'm a very visual learner, and as you guys can see, it's a great way to visually kind of retain that information. Mapping, you can see there's 2 different examples of mapping methods. You can kind of do a hybrid of what works best for you. But it's a strategy, so the mapping method allows you to really understand the relationships between concepts. So you're able to manipulate that information. You're able to draw arrows between concepts, really connect it, and visually see it in your head. This is also a great way if you love color coding or kind of using highlighting or flags to really get in with your highlighters, color coding, and really kind of seeing how all the material relates to each other and have that kind of color visual representation as you're moving forward.
Yeah, this would be a really great way to maybe describe a process if you're in some sort of science course or something related where you can really kind of visually see the steps involved in a process or kind of figure out what different parts make up the whole. So this is, again, like Ashley said, a really good method for visual learners, but kind of for everybody. This could be a way that you capture the information just in a different manner. So something to definitely consider. And
as you guys can see on the bottom kind of left-hand side of the screen, it says extrasensory perception. This kind of, unit mapping method is great for like as you're taking notes, and it's a quick way to jot down information and relationships instead of trying to write it out or write whole sentence structures. So I actually really like this when you're in lecture to kind of insert that into your notes as well.
Right, that's a great point, because like we just talked about, sometimes it's hard to really capture every bit of information in lecture. So if you feel like a visual diagram or a representation would be able to capture the most important pieces of information, and then that reviewing step, so going back through your notes to expand on it and to maybe put this type of graphic representation into written form and to put it into sentences, of course, putting into your own sentences, because that's definitely important, but using this as an initial step within the lectures is a great idea.
All right. So one of the biggest questions that we get asked a lot is about reading strategies. What I hear a lot of feedback from students around campus is that a lot of times the reading load can feel very overwhelming. I've seen your syllabi, you guys have a lot of reading. And so we wanted to really talk about a strategy that makes sure that you're not feeling overwhelmed by the material. So it's more manageable, and that you're retaining the information that you're reading, right? You shouldn't be reading just to reading. You should be getting something out of that reading. And if you can implement this strategy effectively, hopefully it will lead to you spending less time having to go back and rereading because you didn't get it the first time. All right, so the first step of this is previewing, and previewing is really getting the big picture. This is a great way to start off your semester and getting familiar with your textbooks, but even now that we're in the middle of the semester, it's a great way to kind of look ahead of what text might be coming up. Previewing allows you to kind of get in the author's head, right? It helps you anticipate the flow of ideas, and it helps you understand how the material is written, right? So is it a story format? Is it more theoretical? Is it more factual? And so you're not kind of going into it blind. You feel that you're a little bit more comfortable as you start getting into more of those details. When you're previewing your chapters or your book, you want to look at the headings, the subheadings, pictures, graphs, and diagrams in all the chapters. That gives you a feel for it. And then I think one of the most important things is reading the summary at the beginning of the chapters. If there's not a summary at the beginning, looking at those kind of topic sentences of the beginning paragraph, and then looking at the discussion questions or any questions at the end. It also is helpful maybe to kind of review the appendix, or if there's a glossary, to kind of get a feel for what some of the words or ideas that you might be encountering as you read.
Ashley, why do you think it's important to use the discussion questions at the end of the chapter?
So the discussion questions are really important at the end of the chapter because they can kind of help frame how you're reading. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as we talk about scanning, but it kind of gives you boundaries as you're reading of what to know to expect and what to keep in mind as you're looking forward.
And I wouldn't be surprised if professors used or somehow manipulated those types of discussion questions and used them in quizzes and tests. So that could be something that, you kind of look at as a reference. You start looking for that type of information and thinking about, okay, how could the professor use this question, or how can I come up with my own questions to really kind of think about as I'm reading?
Great point. Okay, so the next step, step 2, is for you to skim the assigned reading. All right, so skimming is a method to generate a general understanding from a large quantity of written material. And when you're skimming everything in your assigned reading. And it's a way to really familiarize yourself with the body of the text. It's a starting point to help you kind of understand the main ideas of that assigned reading. We're not saying go skim the entire book in one setting, but if you have to read chapter 1 that evening, then skim chapter 1. And that way you're getting an idea of what the text is that you're going to be reading later on. So step 3 is scanning. And scanning is different than skimming because it's used to locate very specific pieces of information. And when you're scanning, you're using your eye, your finger, or even an index card is really helpful to track the material. So you're moving your eye along, moving that note card along to track material for important words or phrases. And one of the ways that how do you get these ideas of what's important and what's not? One of the most important ways is to identify sections you need to read thoroughly from information from discussion questions within the chapter. So those discussion questions Annie was talking about at the end of the chapter, go back and kind of look at those before you start scanning to keep in mind of what's going on. Topics and questions from lectures. So this might be a good place to go back and look at those notes that you're taking. And it's also a good place to clarify your own questions. As you guys are sitting through class, as you're reading material, your own questions come up. And this is a place where you can really look at that and find those answers and really clarify any thoughts or ideas that you may have.
I really like the strategy of using a finger or an index card, because what we hear a lot from students is that they feel like they keep rereading material, right? So this is a way to really track your place in the material, maybe even make it seem less daunting. So if I'm looking at it a whole page, if I have my index card up way, near the top of the page, I don't have to necessarily see the entire page and feel overwhelmed by the amount of material that I have to read. So I'm really tracking along and kind of helping myself not get lost in all of the material.
Yeah, and I think Annie makes a great point. Having almost just that physical action of tracking it with your index finger, your eyes, or a card, it helps you maintain focus. And I think one of the things I know when I'm reading, a lot of times I lose focus, get distracted by what's coming up or what's going ahead. It really helps set your focus. So when you're scanning and as you're tracking along the material, when you locate that specific word or phrase, definition, or theory from the question you heard in class, that's when you want to stop and slow down and read that section thoroughly, right? So it helps you locate those important points and really get into the details that are related to those questions, that are related to what you guys talked about in class, related to your notes. All right, so the next step is kind of a two-parter. It's read and recite. So for reading, as you're reading, you should be taking notes and writing down information, and this helps you reinforce ideas, right? Because the act of just writing something down helps cement it into your head a second time after you've read it. And the most important thing is that notes should be a summary of your own understanding and not verbatim from the text. And this is so important because if you can be able to write it down and summarize it in your own words, you're going to understand it better and recall it later on in exam.
Right, and I think this is really important because if I'm writing verbatim what's coming from a textbook, that's not my understanding, right? That's the professor's way of communicating the information via textbook. But if I'm able to read the pages, put things in my own words, summarize in my head, and then put that on paper, that's going to actually stick with me more rather than just writing verbatim what the professor, the author has written in the textbook.
And this is especially important if you're using these textbooks or to cite sources for a paper later, right? You always are wanting to write papers and concepts and ideas in your own words. So making sure that last step of summarizing it is a really important next step as you go to write that paper later on. So the second part of step 4 is recite. And this should be done to check your understanding as you're reading. So as you're reading the material, are you asking yourself questions of whether or not you understand it? Are you able to explain the material to another person? This is where I think it's okay to kind of like stop and talk out loud as you're reading the material. I know I'm a big kind of out loud reader, and it's helpful for me because it really helps me stop and make sure I'm checking my understanding, that I'm able to recite that information, that I'm able to answer the questions maybe at the top of the chapter, and really make sure that information is being retained in my head.
And I really like because if I'm able to talk out loud to somebody else and teach it, their understanding is going to be different than my understanding, right? So the way that you understand material may be different than the way I understand it. We can kind of bounce ideas off of each other. If Ashley has a few questions that I didn't even think of, that could really extend my understanding of the material. So really talking out loud is a good strategy to start putting in place as you are kind of getting through your reading material.
Annie, if you don't have someone there with you to kind of talk out loud, do you have the suggestion of maybe what they could do?
Yeah, so I actually really like this one strategy. So if you don't necessarily have a buddy in the class that understands kind of what you're talking about in the course, everybody has an iPhone. We all have some sort of phone that we can use, and we all have a voice memo app or some sort of recording app on our phone. So what I really like to tell students is to talk out loud and record themselves teaching the material to an imaginary person, okay? Listen back to the material to determine, is it actually the correct information? Did I say that out loud correctly? And go back and check your notes to make sure that the information you presented is correct and you are actually able to verbally explain it out loud to somebody.
Great. And this is really important. If you don't understand the material as you're going through and reading and reciting, go back and review it again before you move on to the next section. This is so important to cement those ideas because a lot of times in our reading, as we know, theories build upon each other, and so make sure you go back and understand it. If you still can't understand it after you've read it a couple of times, write that question down, bring it back to class, email your TA, go talk to a friend in the class, make sure you're getting that question answered. All right, so the last step of this reading kind of strategy is review. This is the most important step. And this is really where you're going to check your knowledge after you've done reading that section for your class, maybe tomorrow. This is where Annie talked a little bit about self-testing at the beginning. This is where some of those self-testing strategies comes in. Some great ways to self-test are use some of the tools within the book itself. So there might be discussion questions, at the end of the chapter, go back and answer those. See if you can talk those questions out loud. Look for key terms. If it's definitions, can you define a term? Can you explain a theory? And even come up with your own question. I think just the process of coming up with your own question really makes you think through the material and helps lead to a better understanding of it. Some other great suggestions for self-testing: create a concept map that we were just talking about. If you're having to talk about how material relates to each other, can you draw it out and see those relationships and make those connections? And find a study buddy and discuss the material out loud. If you are reading something, and go to dinner with a friend in the class, see if you guys can talk about it and explain it to each other. And the most important part of review is don't wait until the last minute. This is not something that should be done right before the exam. This is something that should be done consistently to help you master those concepts. And you should continually go back to it to review that material, and that really helps build the knowledge. All right. So now we're going to get into some questions. If you guys have any questions, feel free to either chat them on the chat box, or if you are on the phone, you can speak up and join us on the phone. But I think there are a couple of questions.
Yeah, let's give everybody a few minutes. If you guys have questions, certainly chat it to us. We're looking at the chat right now. If not, we have some other questions from students that we can certainly share with you. But let's just give everybody 1 or 2 minutes, and if you have any questions, certainly chat it to us now. All right, so if you guys still need a few minutes, we will answer some of the questions that we previously received from students. Ashley, do you want to start with them?
Yeah, so one of the questions that someone asked is, as you're reading, how do you really figure out what's important and what's relevant? And so, great question. And I think one of the most important things is, where is that connection, right? So you're not just assigned reading randomly. It usually is supportive of what you're learning in lecture. And there's connections there. So looking for that connection, using tools like the mapping tool, going back to your notes and highlighting sections before you go back to reading, really finding out where those connections are made. And additionally, as Annie talked about, when your professor slows down to explain a concept or says, this is going to be on the test, those are important things to take back. That's why you've got to go back and review your notes, because I think if you're reviewing your notes on a regular basis and then going back and outlining and combining that material with the reading, you'll have a better understanding of what might be on the next exam or what might be coming up. All right, so how do you put the reading into your own words?
Okay, so reading into your own words, I think that's definitely something like we just talked about, but definitely want to hit home, that you really want to summarize things, put it in your own understanding. So if you're able to verbally talk out loud about the material, come up with a few sentences that really captures the main idea and kind of the essence of the information, and then jot that down in your notes. Okay, so really we're not trying to write verbatim what's coming from the textbook. Some things may come verbatim from the textbook, so like a vocab word or a definition that doesn't change, okay? So there are some situations where you might just be taking information from the textbook, but really if you can put things in your own words and the way that you're able to verbally explain it to somebody else, add that information to your notes, because again, you're just gonna remember it later on because it's your understanding, not necessarily the understanding of the author.
So someone asked, how do I test myself on a reading that is not necessarily from a textbook and does not have review questions, such as a paper or an article? And it's a little bit harder, but I think this is where kind of coming up with your own questions is really important. Because as you're coming up with your own questions, they might not be the exact questions that are going to be on the exam, or maybe that your professor will ask in class, but you're having to review that material in your head and you're having to think through that process. If it's an article for a paper and you're having to talk through kind of the research methods, you're actually having to verbalize those methods out loud. Another great way for this is can you summarize that article that you just read? Can you summarize that chapter from that novel that you just read? Can you identify main points or main characters or main ideas? If you had to come in and explain to me about something that happened historically, could you do that within 5 or 10 minutes, right? It's that same kind of concept of an elevator speech. Are you able to explain that theory to someone when you're riding up 5 floors on an elevator and back down?
Yeah, and I think it's helpful if you do start making notes as you're reading, like we talked about, but like in the margins at the end of a paper or an article. Put a few bullet points down as to what your understanding is. That's really helpful. Don't try and keep a mental note of it. Put that information down so you can refer back to it, right?
Yeah. So someone else asked, what strategy do you take if the reading is really dense, like philosophy, critical theory, history, etc.? Lots of abstract details. How much of the details should you write down without missing anything important? So I think my best advice for students who have material that's super dense is to break it up. I think when you're kind of getting into those critical theories or trying to really understand some abstract philosophy, it can get really overwhelming. So how can you section that off so it doesn't feel so overwhelming? And part of that's just some time management of saying, I know I get stressed out after reading, an entire chapter for this. So how do I break up that chapter within the day? How do I make it more manageable? And I think, as Annie said, taking notes, and I think especially in really dense material, making questions that you can go back and clarify with your professor or your TA.
Yeah, I think especially for really long material or dense material, it does take you a bit of time to really break it up over a period of days. So if you know that you've got a long reading ahead or something that's going to take you a little bit more to get through, don't put yourself in a situation where you're reading it, in one night or in one sitting of a, 2-hour time period. So really focus on certain sections at a time, and maybe you're chunking information by concept or by theory, okay? And then you're really just focused on that one bit of information rather than trying to really understand everything all at once.
And I think this is really important where kind of like that mind mapping comes in, to mind map per section to see if you can understand those certain sections of material so you're not feeling overwhelmed. And the second part of that question was, how much of the details should you write down without missing anything important? So you're not supposed to be writing everything down with note taking, right? They're supposed to be a little abbreviated. You're not writing down every word the professor says. You just won't be able to. I think the guideline for kind of making sure you understand details is looking at the professor's cues, right? So really understanding that. But does what you're writing down make sense when you go back home and review those notes? Is it an abbreviation or an acronym that you can come up with on your own to explain it? And I think note-taking is really interactive, right? It's just not taking those notes in class. It's being able to go home and talk out those concepts with a friend. Are you able to explain it to someone else? And I think kind of self-testing yourself is saying, am I able to go and take the details I wrote down in class and explain it to my roommate who's not in the class? And if you can't, maybe then you need to add a little bit more detail to those notes. But I think it's kind of an ever-evolving process. But the key is really, do your notes make sense when you get home? And can someone else read them, ask you about something, and you explain it back?
Yeah, and I think you definitely want to review as you go. So you don't want to keep building on new information and not having a solid foundation of the previously learned material. So if you are still unclear about certain material, reviewing your notes immediately after class is a really great habit. But then at that point, you're reviewing information that you're still unsure of. Immediately schedule time with your TA or professor to clear up that confusion so that the next class, you're still not wondering what the concept was talked about from last class. So you're still building on new information and you've cleared up any misconceptions that are going to stand in your way.
All right. So I think that's all the questions we have today. Like I said, we will be doing a webinar next week, next Wednesday at 5:30, the same Zoom link that we use. If you guys have suggestions or other questions or want to follow up with one of us, feel free to email us or come see us in the Levy Center SES. And if you guys have suggestions for other webinars or things that you guys want to see covered, feel free to email the ARC, and it's just arc@georgetown.edu. Thanks so much for joining, guys. Have a good rest of your night.
Bye.